Hey guys, today we're heading back to a time when England was torn between crowns, crosses, and fires. You're standing in the chill corridors of Tudor palaces, walls heavy with incense, rumors, and the cold stares of kings. Today's story belongs to Mary Tudor, better known by a nickname that drips with blood. But before she became Bloody Mary, she was a princess raised in a royal court, glittering with gold and soaked in quiet danger. She was born in 1516 to King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and her birth was celebrated as the long-awaited heir, though not the male one Henry desperately wanted. From the start, her existence was shaped by politics and religion. Her mother was a devout Catholic and the niece of the powerful Holy Roman Emperor. That made Mary the physical embodiment of a sacred alliance between England and Catholic Europe. As a child, she was brilliant. Fluent in Latin by age 9, skilled in music, and praised by scholars across Europe. She was also deeply religious, shadowing her mother's devotions in chapels filled with flickering candles and whispered Latin prayers. But Mary didn't just inherit a crown's weight. She inherited the fatal rigidity of Catholic dogma, too. Her world began unraveling early. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir and his scandalous infatuation with Anne Boleyn set off a chain of events that would not only split the Church of England from Rome, but also rip Mary's life in two. She watched as her mother was cast aside, her status downgraded, and her legitimacy revoked. And even then, she refused to deny her faith or her mother. Let's just say there's a reason this stuff didn't make it into school, because this isn't some fairy tale tragedy. It's the origin story of a queen whose rage would one day burn through her entire kingdom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing how far these dark stories travel. The fall from princess to pariah came swiftly and without mercy. Mary was 17 when her world collapsed. Her father, King Henry VIII, declared his marriage to her mother null and void, effectively making Mary illegitimate overnight. Her royal title was stripped. She was ordered to stop calling herself princess and instead answer to the Lady Mary. Even worse, she was forbidden from seeing her mother, who had been exiled to a lonely castle in the countryside. Catherine of Aragon would die there, alone, insisting to her final breath that she was England's true queen, and Mary its only lawful heir. For Mary, it was more than a personal loss. It was a spiritual crucifixion. The Church of England was now under Henry's control, its allegiance to the Pope shattered. Catholic masses were banned, priests were imprisoned or executed. The world Mary had known, where the Pope was God's vicar on earth and salvation came through Rome, had been labeled treasonous. Worse still, she was forced to live in the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, the child of Anne Boleyn, the woman her mother called the concubine. It was a daily humiliation. Servants who had once bowed to Mary now ignored her. Royal court became a battlefield of stares and silence, where Mary was both watched and forgotten. But she refused to break, even as courtiers pressured her to sign oaths acknowledging Henry as head of the church. Even as threats of arrest loomed, Mary held fast. For every night she spent alone in her chamber, reading her Latin Bible by candlelight, she drew closer to the identity that would one day define her, the warrior of Catholic England. Still, the isolation left scars. Years of loneliness, paranoia, and spiritual anguish would etch themselves into her soul. She learned to trust no one, not her father, not his wives, not even the shifting loyalties of her own household. What she carried away from those years wasn't just bitterness. It was the belief that God had chosen her to restore order, even if it meant doing so by fire and steel. Years passed in the shadows, and Mary became a ghost in her own country. No longer a princess, never quite a prisoner, she floated through the outskirts of court life, watched, whispered about, but never trusted. Her faith, once a source of noble pride, became a liability. Yet even as the Reformation swept through England like wildfire, Mary clung stubbornly to the old ways. Latin Mass, the Rosary, veneration of saints. These weren't just rituals. They were defiance. They were survival. She was watched constantly, letters intercepted, chaplains arrested. Any slip of the tongue could mean treason. She moved from one royal household to another, a woman whose name was loaded with danger. Her health began to suffer. She was often ill, plagued by headaches, fevers, and mysterious pains. Some say from stress, others suspect slow poisoning. Either way, the weight of her isolation was crushing. And yet, she refused to bend. Every morning, she had Mass in secret. Every evening, she prayed that England would come back to the true faith. The Bible was her constant companion, and the ghost of her mother, her guiding star. She saw herself not as a cast-off royal, but as a future deliverer. In her silence, she made herself a promise. One day, she would return England to the Church, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, the kingdom changed around her. Her father married again and again, birthing more children, executing wives, discarding queens. And then he died. Her half-brother Edward, a Protestant zealot in the body of a boy, took the throne. Mary, now in her 30s, was a relic of another age, a Catholic in a country racing toward Protestantism. She refused to attend Protestant services, despite royal orders. She dared Edward's council to punish her, to make her a martyr. But Edward didn't want a martyr. He wanted her gone. And so, behind closed doors, they began plotting ways to erase her from the line of succession altogether. Mary wasn't just a religious threat. She was a political one. Because if she ever became queen, she would do more than pray. She would purge. And they were right to be afraid. The kingdom shook the day King Edward VI died. He was only 15, pale and sickly to the end, wasting away from what modern historians believe was tuberculosis. But before he drew his final breath, Edward made a desperate attempt to keep Mary off the throne. In a backroom deal driven by Protestant advisors, he rewrote the line of succession, naming Lady Jane Grey, his devout Protestant cousin, as heir to the crown. Lady Jane was just 16 years old, and she didn't want the throne. But her powerful father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, did. She was declared queen upon Edward's death. For 9 days, Jane ruled in name only, propped up by a regime terrified of Mary's return. But Mary wasn't hiding anymore. From her estates in East Anglia, she rode with fire in her eyes and Catholic banners raised high. Loyalists flocked to her. Commoners, nobles, and soldiers alike saw her not as a relic, but as the true daughter of Henry VIII. She rallied her forces, sent bold proclamations across the country, and prepared for war. The coup collapsed in a heartbeat. Even London turned against Jane. The tide of loyalty swung so fast that Northumberland's own troops deserted him. Mary entered the city to cheers, bells ringing out from every church tower. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London. And Mary, after decades of humiliation, exile, and heartbreak, was crowned Queen of England. It was an astonishing reversal of fate. She had gone from bastard to monarch in a single month. But if anyone thought Mary would be merciful, they were tragically mistaken. Her ascension was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning. Because Mary believed her reign was divine justice, not just for her, but for her mother, for the Pope, for the centuries of Catholic tradition that had been ripped apart by reformers. She wasn't here to compromise. She was here to correct history. With a crown upon her head and a rosary in her hand, Mary stepped into power with holy vengeance in her heart. And soon, the fires would follow. Mary was now queen, but England was no longer hers to command without resistance. Beneath the cheering crowds and ringing bells lurked factions of nobles, Protestants and opportunists who saw her reign as a threat to everything they had gained under Henry and Edward. Her very presence on the throne was a challenge to the country's recent Protestant identity. And then came the Spanish question. Mary was nearing 40, childless, and seen as past the age of safe motherhood. But if she didn't produce an heir, the crown would pass to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. That to Mary was unacceptable. She needed a husband, quickly, and one with the right religion, the right rank, and preferably the power to help crush Protestant resistance. Enter Philip of Spain. He was the son of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and a champion of Catholic absolutism. The match was political dynamite. To Mary, Philip offered stability, alliance, and a chance to restore Catholic England to its rightful place in the arms of Rome. But to her subjects, he was a foreign invader, a Spanish prince who would rule England through her. The backlash was immediate. Rebellions flared, most notably Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, led by English nobles who feared the marriage would reduce England to a Spanish satellite. Thousands rose against her, marching toward London. Mary responded not with panic, but with iron. She stood firm, rallied the city, and crushed the rebellion. Over 90 rebels were executed. Jane Grey, the tragic 9 Days Queen, was also beheaded, guilt by bloodline, a warning to all. And still, she married Philip. Their wedding in Winchester Cathedral was grand, solemn, and utterly joyless. Philip barely spoke English. He found Mary's appearance and age off-putting, and the two had little in common beyond faith and power. Nonetheless, Mary adored him. She believed their union was divinely sanctioned, but it would produce the son who would inherit a fully restored Catholic kingdom. Instead, it ignited deeper unrest. England's identity was now split, between the past Mary clung to and the future she feared. And as her grip tightened, her enemies braced for what was coming next. Because Mary wasn't finished. She was just getting started. And then the fires began. Mary's first executions of Protestant dissenters didn't come immediately. At first, she focused on purging the most dangerous rebels, the ones with swords and followers. But it wasn't enough. Her enemies weren't just in the countryside. They were in pulpits, in parishes, in books. Ideas, not just armies, were threatening her reign. Heretics, as she saw them, were poisoning the soul of England. In 1555, she acted. The Heresy Acts were revived, laws that allowed for the prosecution and execution of anyone preaching Protestant doctrine. Trials began. Most were public. Most ended with fire. The first to burn was John Rogers, a preacher who had helped produce the English Bible under Henry's reform. He was dragged through the streets of London, chained to a stake, and set ablaze in front of a crowd that included his wife and 10 children. He did not recant. More followed. Bishops, pastors, artisans, widows, pregnant women. Their crimes: denying transubstantiation, refusing to attend Mass, owning Protestant texts. Mary believed she was saving their souls. Better to die in flames and find salvation than to live in blasphemy. But the spectacle backfired. Crowds who came to jeer sometimes left in tears. The victims often went to the flames singing psalms, their courage unsettling even hardened guards. Some wept, some cursed, others stood in silence. But each fire lit more than just timber. It ignited sympathy, outrage, and fear. The term Bloody Mary didn't come from her enemies at court. It came from the whispers of the people. Mary didn't see herself as cruel. She saw herself as cleansing, restoring, fulfilling God's justice. But the more she burned, the more isolated she became. Philip, now more interested in continental wars, spent increasing time abroad. The people who once welcomed Mary now crossed themselves when she passed, unsure whether she was queen or executioner. Still, she pressed on, because to Mary this wasn't cruelty, it was obedience. And if England wouldn't return to God willingly, it would return in ashes. As the fires grew, so did the machine that fed them. Mary's regime didn't burn Protestants in fits of rage. It burned them with chilling order. Heresy trials became part of public life, woven into the legal and religious fabric of England. Bishops like Edmund Bonner earned reputations as bloody instruments of the crown, overseeing confessions, condemning suspects, and organizing executions with bureaucratic precision. It wasn't just famous names who burned. It was blacksmiths, housewives, students. One teenager was executed for refusing to attend Mass. Another man, deaf and unable to follow the service, was condemned because officials assumed he was being willfully defiant. Over 280 people were executed during Mary's reign, most of them burned alive. No English monarch before or after would match that total for religious executions. The process was grimly theatrical. A suspect was accused, often by neighbors or parish priests. Then came interrogation, sometimes with threats, sometimes with promises of mercy. If the accused recanted, they might be spared. If they stood firm, they were branded a heretic. The sentence: death by fire, usually in the town square. The message was clear. The body must be destroyed so the soul might be saved. What's more chilling is how routine it became. Markets continued. Shops stayed open. Children watched from rooftops as the condemned were marched through cobbled streets. Public burnings were announced in advance, gruesome events, but also spectacles. Mary's government wanted people to watch, to feel the heat, to remember the cost of straying from Rome. But instead of stamping out Protestantism, the executions fed it. Each martyr became a symbol. Smuggled pamphlets told their stories. Underground congregations whispered their names in prayer. The blood of the burned became ink for a new chapter of resistance. And Mary, who believed she was guiding England back into God's light, was becoming the face of horror. Her enemies no longer needed swords. They had something far more effective: her record. The Queen had become her own worst weapon. By 1557, the flames had consumed more than heretics. They had consumed Mary herself. Her court, once vibrant with the pageantry of a restored Catholic kingdom, had grown grim. Ministers avoided her gaze. Foreign ambassadors tread carefully. Even Philip, her husband and supposed partner in faith, had all but vanished, off fighting wars for Spain, leaving Mary to rule a country that increasingly feared her more than it obeyed her. But she didn't stop. She believed England's soul was still sick.
that too many Protestants still poisoned the land with quiet defiance. The trials intensified. More fires, more families destroyed. Even towns with no history of rebellion found themselves hosting executions, all in the name of cleansing. To enforce this order, Mary leaned on a tool more lasting than flame: the law. Heresy commissions spread through the countryside. Bishops were empowered to hunt dissent, record conversions, and punish resistance. Church attendance wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Failure to conform could cost you your land, your livelihood, your life. And so terror became institutionalized. People whispered in code. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Some households held secret Protestant services in basements, covering windows and teaching their children to pray silently. Others, fearing exposure, abandoned their faith altogether, or at least pretended to. Public conformity became a mask for survival, but Mary was convinced she was winning. To her, each conversion was a soul reclaimed. Each fire was a step towards salvation. She believed God would reward her for her suffering, and for the country's. Yet she was growing weaker. She was often sick, suffering fevers, stomach pains, and exhaustion. She still hadn't conceived an heir, and each month brought renewed desperation. She wept privately, confided only in priests, clung to signs and omens. She fasted, prayed, and gave alms. But the heavens remained silent. Even as England trembled under her rule, Mary feared one truth above all. If she died childless, everything she had built, every burning stake, every law, every sermon, would fall to dust under Elizabeth's Protestant hands. The fires might have silenced voices, but they hadn't secured a future.
Then came the pregnancies, or at least what seemed like them. In 1554, shortly after marrying Philip, Mary announced she was with child. The court rejoiced. Bells rang across the kingdom. Prayers of thanksgiving echoed from every cathedral. For Mary, this was more than personal. It was divine validation. A Catholic heir would be the final triumph. A sign from God that England's return to Rome was not only just, but destined. She retreated to a private chamber in Hampton Court Palace, awaiting the birth. But months passed. Her belly swelled, her appetite changed, and preparations for the royal birth continued. Physicians predicted an early summer delivery. No child came. By July, the mood shifted. Whispers crept through court corridors. Had the Queen lied? Was it a tumor, a case of false pregnancy? Even her own attendants couldn't explain it. Finally, the symptoms faded. There was no baby, no heir, only humiliation. And then, astonishingly, it happened again. In 1557, Mary once more declared herself pregnant. Once more, England held its breath, and once more, nothing came of it. This second phantom pregnancy shattered her remaining hope. Her health spiraled, her limbs swelled, she grew thin and pale. Some claimed it was uterine cancer, others blamed melancholy. But whatever the cause, Mary knew she was dying, and with her, the Catholic future she had fought for. Philip had long since withdrawn, sending cold letters from abroad. He returned briefly, not for love, but to ask England to support his war with France. Mary agreed, hoping perhaps it would bring him closer. Instead, it brought disaster. England lost Calais, its last foothold on the European continent. The humiliation was complete. Mary's mind, once sharp with conviction, dulled into sorrow. She wandered palace corridors mumbling prayers. She confessed for hours. Some say she believed her suffering mirrored that of Christ, that her failures were trials sent by God. And, perhaps in her final hours, she understood. The fires had not saved England. They had scorched it. She had tried to shape the soul of a nation with fear, and now that nation waited for her death, like a prisoner waits for morning. She would leave no child, no glory, only smoke. Mary Tudor died on November 17th, 1558, just before dawn. The windows of St. James's Palace remained shuttered. Inside, candles flickered beside her bed, casting long shadows on the pale walls. Her breath had grown shallow, her skin grey. Her final days were filled with murmured prayers and quiet sobbing from her attendants. No husband at her side, no child to carry her name. Only priests and silence. She was 42 years old. According to chroniclers, her last words were a lament. "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." Calais, the last jewel of English power in France, lost in a war she approved only to please Philip. It was not just a military defeat. It was a wound to her pride, her policy, and her belief in divine favor. The moment she died, England exhaled. Her half-sister Elizabeth was proclaimed queen within hours. Protestant exiles returned home. Church walls were stripped of their icons. Latin masses vanished almost overnight. The Heresy Acts were repealed. The Marian burnings became a cautionary tale. Mary's dream of a Catholic England crumbled faster than the ashes of her martyrs. Even her burial reflected the nation's unease. She was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, in the same tomb where Elizabeth would later be buried. 2 queens, 2 sisters, 1 grave. But only Elizabeth's name was inscribed on the monument. History, as always, chose its favorite. Mary's legacy became a myth of horror. Bloody Mary, the name children chant in darkened bathrooms, looking into mirrors. Her real achievements, restoring coinage, strengthening naval defenses, forging an alliance with Spain, were erased by fire and fear. She became a caricature, a hysterical Catholic, a barren queen, a cruel fanatic. But peel back the myth, and something more complex emerges. Mary was a woman raised in a court of lies, betrayal, and ideological war. She clung to the only constants she knew, faith and duty, and tried to rule with both. But she ruled with wounds instead of wisdom. She mistook terror for conviction, and in the end, England remembered her not as a restorer, but as a warning. Still, her reign mattered, because her fires lit the road to Elizabeth's, because she forced the country to choose a path, and because even in her failure, Mary changed the stakes of what it meant to be a queen. Now that the fires have burned out, and the echoes of Mary's reign have faded, let's take a moment to breathe. History often remembers people in extremes. Mary Tudor, unfortunately, drew the short end of that memory. Her story is rarely told with nuance, just the nickname, Bloody Mary, and the terrifying tales of smoke and screams. But she wasn't a monster. She was a product of one of the most brutal and unstable political environments in European history. She was raised to be obedient, trained to be devout, and then thrown into a world where religion and survival were inseparable. And if she ruled with fear, it's because fear had shaped every corner of her life. What's eerie is how familiar this all sounds. A society ripped in half by ideology, leaders choosing loyalty tests over compassion, mass hysteria fanned by law, politics, and faith. We like to think we've moved past that kind of darkness. But Mary's story, her mistakes, her pain, her desperate grasp for certainty, feels hauntingly modern. Maybe that's why her ghost lingers. Maybe she's not just the figure behind a playground mirror game. Maybe she's a warning we're still not ready to hear. So, if you made it this far, thank you. You've just walked through a reign lit by flame, crowned with sorrow, and buried beneath a name history never let go of. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is,
I'm always curious where these shadows reach. And hey, if you enjoyed this journey through one of the darkest corners of royal history, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'll be back soon with another tale. Until then, stay curious and keep your torches lit. End of script. Enjoy the rest of your day.